The morning air hung thick with tension inside the federal courthouse lobby. It was March 15th, and the marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights as early morning visitors began filtering through security checkpoints. Among them was a woman who would soon turn one officer's world completely upside down. Sarah Washington stepped through the entrance doors with quiet confidence, her professional suit immaculate, her leather briefcase polished and expensive-looking. She had legitimate business there, a visitor's pass already in hand. But Officer Marcus Cain wasn't interested in checking credentials. He was interested in making assumptions. "Wrong building, sweetheart." Cain's voice cut through the lobby like a blade. "The food stamps office is down the street." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Sarah stopped, her expression remaining calm despite the insult. She pulled out her visitor's pass, holding it forward with steady hands. "I have business here," he said evenly. Cain scoffed, his contempt obvious. "What business? Baby daddy locked up again?" Sarah's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed controlled. "I'm here for a court proceeding, officer." "Sure you are." Cain's tone turned nastier, dripping with condescension. He stepped closer, invading her space, his badge glinting in the overhead lights. "People like you don't belong in real courtrooms." Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "People like me? Don't play dumb." Cain moved even closer, his contempt radiating off him like heat. "This isn't some ghetto drama show." Before Sarah could respond, before she could even process what was happening, Cain's hand cracked across her face. The sound echoed through the courthouse lobby like a gunshot. Sarah's visitor's pass scattered to the floor, papers sliding across the polished marble. Her hand moved to her cheek, fingers touching the place where his palm had connected with her skin. Pain radiated through her face, but she didn't cry out. She didn't yell. She didn't give Cain the satisfaction. Bystanders in the lobby froze, staring in shock. Some pulled out their phones. Others simply stood with mouths open, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. "Keep your fake papers and get out," Cain sneered, standing over her scattered documents like a conqueror. Sarah slowly bent down, collecting her papers one by one with deliberate precision. Her movements were measured, controlled, refusing to be rushed or intimidated. As she gathered the last document, she looked up at Cain's badge, reading his nameplate carefully. "Officer Cain," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the throbbing in her cheek. "I won't forget this." Cain laughed dismissively as Sarah turned and walked away, her dignity intact even as her face began to swell. He had no idea what he'd just done. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. Have you ever been completely underestimated because of how others saw you? Have you ever had someone look at you and decide in an instant that you didn't belong, that you weren't worthy of basic respect or human dignity? That's exactly what happened to Sarah Washington that morning. But what Officer Marcus Cain didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that the woman he just humiliated would soon have the power to end his career with a single decision. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the federal courtroom was electric with tension. The civil rights lawsuit, Washington versus Cain, was about to begin, and the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the back rows, their notebooks open and ready. Community members who'd heard about the case sat shoulder to shoulder, watching intently. This wasn't just another lawsuit. This was about accountability. Marcus Cain sat at the defendant's table. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Peterson, leaning close and whispering final instructions. Cain looked confident, almost relaxed. 20 years of getting away with things had taught him that the system would protect him. It always had before. Why would this time be any different? When his name was called, Cain stood and walked to the witness stand with the swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. He'd rehearsed his story with Peterson dozens of times. Every word was calculated, every detail designed to paint Sarah as the aggressor and himself as the professional, just doing his job. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. His lawyer began the questioning, his voice smooth and sympathetic. "Officer Cain, please tell the court what happened on the morning of March 15th. Cain straightened his tie, his movements deliberate and controlled. He looked directly at the jury, making eye contact with several jurors as if to establish connection and trust. "I was performing my assigned duties at the courthouse security checkpoint," Cain began, his voice steady and professional, "when I observed a suspicious individual attempting to bypass standard protocols." The lie came easily. He'd told versions of this story before, to supervisors, to review boards, to internal affairs investigators, and every time they'd believed him. "Can you describe this individual's behavior?" Peterson prompted. "The defendant was acting aggressively from the moment she approached my station," Cain continued, warming to his fabricated narrative. "She refused to follow basic security procedures and became hostile when I attempted to verify her credentials." Across the courtroom, Sarah Washington sat at the plaintiff's table. She was representing herself, a decision that had surprised many observers. But Sarah had her reasons that would become clear soon enough. As Cain spun his lies, she took careful notes, her expression neutral, giving nothing away. "When I asked to examine her documentation," Cain continued, "she became physically aggressive. She advanced toward me in a threatening manner, forcing me to respond according to my defensive training protocols." Peterson nodded sympathetically, as if Cain's version of events was the most reasonable thing in the world. "And what did this defensive response entail?" Peterson asked. "I was forced to restrain the individual when she became a clear threat to courthouse security," Cain replied, his voice taking on a tone of regretful necessity. "Everything I did was within departmental guidelines for threat assessment and public safety." The prosecutor assisting Sarah's case, a young woman named Martinez, immediately objected, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, the defendant is characterizing assault as restraint." Judge Martinez, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years on the bench, didn't hesitate. "Sustained. The witness will stick to factual descriptions of his actions." Cain's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. But he recovered quickly. "I made minimal physical contact to neutralize what I perceived as an imminent threat to myself and courthouse personnel," he said, carefully choosing his words. Peterson continued guiding Cain through the testimony, building a portrait of a dedicated officer simply doing his job. "Officer Cain, in your 20 years of service, have you ever been accused of inappropriate conduct?" "Never," Cain said firmly, his voice full of conviction. "My record is spotless. I've received commendations for my dedication to public safety and professional conduct. I've protected this courthouse from genuine threats for 2 decades. His confidence was growing now, feeding on his own narrative. "What happened that day was a textbook example of proper security protocol," Cain continued. "The individual was attempting to gain unauthorized access using suspicious documentation. When confronted, she became belligerent and aggressive." "Can you elaborate on the suspicious nature of her documentation?" Peterson asked. Cain leaned forward slightly, as if sharing insider knowledge. "The papers appeared hastily prepared, possibly forged," he explained. "In my experience, genuine court documents have specific security features that were absent from her materials." Sarah's pen stopped moving. She looked up at Cain, her expression one of quiet disbelief. He was doubling down on every lie, digging himself deeper with every word. But Cain didn't notice. He was too busy performing for the jury. "I've seen every type of fake credential imaginable," he continued. "Drug dealers, gang members, people trying to smuggle contraband into the courthouse. This individual fit the profile perfectly." "What profile is that, Officer Cain?" Peterson asked. "Someone with no legitimate business in a federal courthouse," Cain replied smoothly, attempting to gain access through deception and intimidation. Martinez stood again, her objection immediate. "Your Honor, the witness is making character assumptions without foundation." The judge considered for a moment, then shook her head. "Overruled. The witness may describe his professional assessment." Cain smiled slightly, a small victory that emboldened him further. "My professional assessment was that this individual posed a potential security risk," he said. "Her demeanor, her confrontational attitude, and her suspicious documentation all raised red flags." "Did you attempt to de-escalate the situation?" Peterson asked. "Absolutely," Cain replied without hesitation. "I repeatedly asked her to comply with standard procedures. I explained courthouse policies calmly and professionally. She refused to cooperate at every turn." The lies were flowing now, each one building on the last, constructing an alternate reality where Cain was the victim and Sarah was the threat. "When she began advancing aggressively toward the security station," Cain continued, "I had to make a split-second decision to protect myself and others." Peterson nodded gravely. "In your training, how are officers instructed to handle such situations?" "We're taught to use the minimum force necessary to neutralize a threat," Cain replied. "That's exactly what I did. I used a standard defensive technique to create distance and prevent further escalation." Cain's body language radiated confidence now. He sat straighter, his voice stronger, believing his own performance. He'd gotten away with this kind of thing for 20 years. Why would today be any different? "Officer Cain," Peterson said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "was there any racial motivation in your actions that day?" Cain looked directly at the jury, his expression one of wounded integrity. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "I treat every person who enters this courthouse with equal professionalism, regardless of their background. I've been protecting people of all races and ethnicities for 20 years. He paused for effect, then looked directly at Sarah for the first time since taking the stand. "If this individual had been white, Asian, Hispanic, or any other ethnicity," Cain said slowly, "my response would have been identical. I assess threats based on behavior, not appearance." The lie came so easily that Cain almost believed it himself. "Furthermore," Cain continued, his voice taking on an edge of righteous indignation, "I believe this lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to capitalize on current social tensions. The plaintiff is trying to turn a routine security incident into something it wasn't." Martinez objected again, but the judge allowed Cain to finish his thought. "I've seen this pattern before," Cain said, warming to his theme. "Someone breaks courthouse rules, gets held accountable, then claims discrimination to avoid responsibility. It undermines the real struggles of people who face actual prejudice." The presentation of evidence was carefully orchestrated by Cain's defense team. Peterson stood and approached the evidence table, where a laptop was connected to the courtroom's display system. "Your Honor, we'd like to present body cam footage from Officer Cain on the day in question," Peterson announced. The lights dimmed slightly as the video began to play on the large screen visible to the entire courtroom. But something was immediately suspicious about the footage to anyone paying close attention. The video started mid-interaction, conveniently beginning after the initial confrontation. The edited footage showed Sarah appearing to move toward Cain, her body language captured at an angle that could be interpreted as aggressive. The audio had been carefully manipulated, too. Cain's provocative comments were completely absent, replaced with what sounded like professional warnings. "As you can see," Peterson explained to the jury, his laser pointer, highlighting Sarah's movements on screen. This footage clearly shows the plaintiff advancing aggressively toward Officer Cain. His response was measured and appropriate given the perceived threat. Sarah watched the edited video with barely concealed disgust. She knew the truth. She had the truth. But would the jury see through this manufactured evidence? The defense wasn't finished building their case. Peterson called two fellow officers to the stand as character witnesses, Officers Jenkins and Rodriguez, both longtime colleagues of Cain. Jenkins testified first, his praise effusive and rehearsed. "Marcus has always treated everyone fairly," Jenkins said, his voice confident. "He's one of the most respectful officers I've ever worked with. He goes above and beyond to help people navigate the courthouse system. I've worked alongside him for 15 years, and I've never witnessed any inappropriate behavior." Rodriguez's testimony echoed the same themes, painting Cain as a mentor, a role model, a dedicated public servant who devoted his career to protecting the courthouse and everyone in it. "In all my years working with Officer Cain," Rodriguez testified, "I've never seen him treat anyone differently because of their race or background. He's professional with everyone. If anything, he's sometimes too patient with difficult visitors." The defense was building a wall of credibility around Cain, using the testimony of fellow officers to shield him from accountability. When Cain returned to the stand for redirect examination, additional questioning by his own lawyer, his confidence had transformed into something bordering on arrogance. He believed he was winning. "Officer Cain," Peterson said, his voice taking on a tone of sympathetic concern, "how has this false accusation affected you and your family?" Cain's expression shifted, his voice taking on a wounded quality that seemed almost practiced. "It's been devastating," he said, shaking his head slowly. "My wife and children have had to endure public scrutiny and accusations based on lies. My 20-year reputation, built on dedication and service, has been unfairly tarnished by someone seeking a financial windfall." He paused, as if struggling with emotion. "My kids have been bullied at school," Cain continued. "My wife can't go to the grocery store without people whispering and staring. All because this woman decided to turn a routine security interaction into a racial incident for profit." "Do you regret your actions that day?" Peterson asked. Cain's answer was immediate and forceful. "I regret that this individual chose to escalate a routine security check into a confrontation," he said. "I regret that she's chosen to pursue this frivolous lawsuit instead of taking responsibility for her behavior. But I don't regret doing my job. I don't regret protecting the courthouse and the people in it." He looked directly at the jury again, his expression one of practiced sincerity. "I've dedicated my career to protecting people and ensuring courthouse security," Cain said. "I won't apologize for doing my job professionally and effectively. I can only control my own actions, and my actions that day were appropriate, measured, and necessary." As Cain stepped down from the witness stand, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction with his performance. He'd painted Sarah as an aggressive opportunist looking for a payday. He'd presented himself as a dedicated public servant unfairly targeted by false accusations. His edited video evidence supported his version of events, and his character witnesses had vouched for his integrity and professionalism. Cain glanced across the courtroom at Sarah with barely concealed contempt. She was still taking notes, still maintaining that irritating composure, but he was confident the jury would see through her act. After all, who were they going to believe? A respected law enforcement officer with 20 years of unblemished service, supported by colleagues and documented evidence, or someone who clearly had an agenda and a financial motive? The system had protected Cain before. It had protected him from 15 previous complaints. It had protected him when citizens reported his behavior. It had protected him when supervisors looked the other way, rather than deal with the messy business of accountability. He was certain it would protect him again. Cain had no idea that his carefully constructed lies were about to crumble in ways he never imagined possible. He had no idea that sitting across from him, taking notes with quiet patience, was someone with the knowledge, experience, and soon the authority to expose everything he'd spent 20 years hiding. The trap was set. Sarah Washington just needed to spring it at exactly the right moment. When Sarah rose to take the witness stand, something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. Her movements were deliberate and graceful, carrying an authority that seemed to fill the space around her without her having to demand it. She wore a navy blue suit that spoke of understated power, the kind of clothing chosen by someone who didn't need flashy displays to command respect. Her leather briefcase, clearly expensive and meticulously organized, sat prominently at the plaintiff's table. Even small details, her watch, her pen, the leather folder containing her notes, suggested someone whose life was built on precision and professionalism. "Please state your name for the record," Martinez said. "Sarah Elizabeth Washington." Her voice was calm and precise, the kind of voice that commanded attention without demanding it. There was something about the way she spoke, measured, controlled, authoritative, that made people lean forward and listen. "Miss Washington, please tell the court what happened on March 15th at the federal courthouse." Sarah's recounting of events was methodical and detailed, each word chosen carefully. "I arrived at the courthouse at approximately 9:15 a.m. for legitimate business," Sarah began. "I approached the security checkpoint with proper identification and a valid visitor's pass clearly visible in my hand." Cain shifted uncomfortably at the defendant's table, something in Sarah's tone making him uneasy for the first time since the trial began. "Officer Cain immediately made assumptions about my presence," Sarah continued. "Without examining my credentials, without following any standard security protocol, he directed me to leave. He suggested I belonged at the welfare office instead." She paused, checking her notes that were meticulously organized in what appeared to be a legal folder with multiple tabs and color-coded sections. Everything about her presentation suggested someone deeply familiar with courtroom procedures. "When I attempted to show my visitor's pass," Sarah continued, "Officer Cain made several derogatory comments about my character and background. He asked if my baby daddy was locked up again. He stated that people like me don't belong in real courtrooms." The courtroom was silent, everyone hanging on her words. "How did you respond to these comments?" Martinez asked. "I remained calm and attempted to explain that I had legitimate business at the courthouse," Sarah replied. "I did not raise my voice, make any threatening gestures, or behave aggressively in any way." Sarah's composure was remarkable. Even recounting this humiliation, even describing being reduced to stereotypes and assumptions, her voice never wavered. Her professionalism never cracked. She spoke with the controlled emotion of someone who'd faced worse and survived, someone who understood that justice required patience. "Then what happened?" Martinez prompted. Sarah's next words fell like stones into still water. "Officer Cain struck me across the face with an open palm," she said simply. "The force was sufficient to leave a visible mark and cause my visitor's pass to fall to the floor." Peterson jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is characterizing a defensive restraint as an assault." Sarah turned slightly toward Peterson, and for just a moment something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but a kind of knowing patience that suggested she'd dealt with men like him before. Men who twisted words, who redefined violence as procedure, who protected other men at the expense of truth. "Sustained," Judge Martinez ruled. "The witness will describe the physical contact without characterization." Sarah nodded, accepting the ruling without complaint. "Officer Cain made contact with my face using his open palm," she said carefully. The contact was forceful enough to turn my head and cause a stinging sensation that lasted several minutes. It also caused my visitor's pass and other documents to scatter to the floor. She reached into her briefcase with practiced ease, producing a manila folder. I have medical documentation of the resulting contusion, Sarah said, photographed 3 hours after the incident by Dr. Patricia Carter at Richmond General Hospital. The photos were entered into evidence and passed to the jury. They showed clear bruising on Sarah's left cheek, the distinct pattern of finger marks still visible even hours after the assault. Several jurors visibly reacted, their expressions shifting from neutral observation to genuine concern. Miss Washington, Martinez continued, what did you do after this physical contact occurred? I collected my documents from the floor, Sarah replied, her voice steady. I read Officer Cain's name tag aloud to ensure I had his correct identification. I then left the courthouse and immediately sought medical attention for documentation purposes. Sarah glanced at her watch, an expensive timepiece that somehow conveyed both punctuality and authority in a single gesture. Everything about her was intentional, nothing left to chance. Peterson stood for cross-examination, clearly expecting to rattle this pro se plaintiff who dared to represent herself in federal court. He approached the witness stand with barely concealed condescension. Miss Washington, Peterson began, his tone suggesting he was speaking to a child. Isn't it true that you were attempting to gain unauthorized access to restricted courthouse areas? Sarah's response was immediate and precise. No, I had a valid visitor's pass for the specific proceedings I intended to observe. And what proceedings were those? Peterson asked, as if he'd caught her in a lie. Sarah glanced at her watch again, a subtle movement that somehow conveyed she was keeping track of something specific, something important. I was there to observe police reform hearings as an interested citizen, she replied calmly. Peterson scoffed slightly. An interested citizen? What qualifies your interest in police reform? Something almost resembling a smile crossed Sarah's face. Not amusement, but anticipation. I have extensive experience with police accountability measures and departmental oversight protocols, she said. The answer seemed to catch Peterson off guard, but he pressed on. What kind of experience could you possibly have with police oversight? He asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. Sarah's eyes met his directly, and in that moment Peterson should have realized he was walking into a trap. I've studied various reform implementation strategies, Sarah replied carefully, and have particular familiarity with Officer Cain's service record and approach to community relations. Cain leaned forward at the defendant's table, whispering urgently to Peterson. How could this woman know about his service record? What was she talking about? Peterson recovered quickly, trying to turn Sarah's statement against her. Miss Washington, are you suggesting you researched Officer Cain before this incident? That you perhaps targeted him deliberately? I'm saying I'm quite familiar with patterns of misconduct, Sarah replied evenly, and the institutional failures that enable them. Her legal knowledge was becoming increasingly apparent with every exchange. She objected to several of Peterson's questions with precise citations of procedural rules, demonstrating an understanding of courtroom protocol that seemed far beyond what a typical pro se plaintiff would possess. Objection, Your Honor, Sarah said at one point. Counsel is asking compound questions and assuming facts not in evidence. Federal Rules of Evidence 611. Sustained, Judge Martinez ruled, looking at Sarah with new interest. Peterson was visibly flustered now. This wasn't going according to plan. The pro se plaintiff he'd expected to steamroll was demonstrating legal expertise that rivaled his own. Miss Washington, Peterson said, trying a different approach, why are you representing yourself instead of hiring qualified counsel? Sarah's response was measured and confident. I believe I'm quite qualified to represent my own interests in this matter, she said. But surely someone with actual legal training would be more appropriate, Peterson pressed. Objection, argumentative, Sarah said immediately. Sustained, the judge ruled. Sarah checked her watch again. It was 1:45 p.m. She seemed to be counting down to something, waiting for a specific moment. Miss Washington, Peterson continued, what do you hope to gain from this lawsuit? Sarah's answer was simple and powerful. Justice, accountability, and assurance that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. Are you seeking monetary damages? Peterson asked, confident he'd caught her in an admission of greed. I'm seeking systemic change, Sarah replied. The money, if awarded, will be donated to police bias training programs. This answer clearly surprised Peterson and several members of the jury. Most civil rights plaintiffs were primarily interested in financial compensation, using the lawsuit as a path to a settlement. But Sarah was different. You're not interested in personal financial gain? Peterson asked, skeptical. No, Sarah said firmly. This case is about institutional accountability and the abuse of power. Her responses were becoming more confident, more authoritative with each exchange. She spoke about police procedures and civil rights law with the precision of someone deeply familiar with both, not as an outside observer, but as someone who understood these systems from the inside. Miss Washington, Peterson said, frustration creeping into his voice, how do you explain your extensive knowledge of police procedures and legal protocols? Sarah smiled, a real smile this time, one that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this question. All will become clear very soon, she said. She checked her watch once more. 1:52 p.m. In fact, Sarah continued, I have a very important appointment at 2:12 p.m. that may provide additional context for these proceedings. Judge Martinez looked puzzled, glancing at the courtroom clock. Miss Washington, are you requesting a recess? The judge asked. Not requesting, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. But I believe the court may find it beneficial when my 2 p.m. appointment arrives. Cain was growing increasingly agitated at the defendant's table. Something about Sarah's confidence, her legal knowledge, her mysterious references to his service record, none of it made sense. Who was this woman? What did she know? And what was happening at 2 p.m.? Miss Washington, Peterson continued, his voice taking on an edge of desperation, isn't it true that you're simply an activist seeking to profit from false allegations of racism? Sarah's composure never broke, but her voice carried a new edge of authority when she responded. Counselor, she said slowly, I think you'll find that assumption to be very poorly informed. At exactly 1:58 p.m., Sarah's phone, sitting on the plaintiff's table, buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and that knowing smile returned, wider this time. Your Honor, Sarah said, standing, I believe my 2 p.m. appointment has arrived at the courthouse. With the court's permission, I think this individual's presence may shed considerable light on these proceedings. The courtroom stirred with curiosity. Journalists shifted in their seats, sensing something significant was about to happen. Community members leaned forward. Even the judge looked intrigued. Cain shifted nervously, a cold feeling of dread settling in his stomach. Something was about to go very wrong for him. He could feel it. Sarah Washington sat back in her chair, the picture of calm confidence, as if she'd been orchestrating this entire moment from the very beginning. As if every word, every objection, every carefully timed glance at her watch had been building to whatever was about to walk through those courtroom doors. Before we continue, if Sarah's calm confidence in the face of all that disrespect is hitting you the way it's hitting me, drop a comment below and tell me what part of this story has you most on edge so far. I read every single one. But to understand what was about to happen in that courtroom, we need to go back. Back to the evening before the trial, when Sarah Washington sat in her home office. surrounded by the quiet symbols of a life most people never would have guessed she'd lived. The walls told a story that Marcus Cain could never have imagined. Police Academy graduation photos hung in neat rows, documenting years of service. FBI training certificates were framed beside commendations for Detective of the Year. Awards for community service excellence shared space with photos of Sarah in various police uniforms, spanning 2 decades of law enforcement work. A law degree from Howard University hung prominently, the gold seal catching light from the desk lamp. Next to it, certificates in criminal justice, public administration, and police management studies. This was not the office of someone trying to game the system. This was the office of someone who dedicated her life to justice, not just seeking it, but administering it. That evening, Sarah's attention was focused on a thick manila folder labeled Cain, Marcus, Personnel Review. Inside were 15 misconduct complaints spread across her desk, like evidence at a crime scene. 8 of them had been dismissed without proper investigation, buried under procedural technicalities and institutional protection. The pattern was unmistakable. Another pattern of abuse, Sarah murmured, reviewing case files that showed Cain consistently targeting people of color for additional screening, harassment disguised as security protocol, verbal abuse rationalized as professional communication. Her laptop displayed a video call with Police Commissioner Reynolds, who was reviewing final preparations for tomorrow's announcement. "The timing is perfect, Sarah," Reynolds said through the screen, his face serious but supportive. "The swearing-in ceremony at 2:00 p.m. will send a clear message about our commitment to accountability and reform. Are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded, her mind already focused on the complex choreography of tomorrow's events, testimony in the morning, building the case methodically, and then at exactly 2 p.m., the moment when Marcus Cain would discover that the woman he'd humiliated was about to become the most powerful person in his professional world. "Cain has no idea what's coming," Sarah said quietly. "His arrogance will be his downfall." The office door opened, and Sarah's 17-year-old daughter Maya entered, her expression concerned. She'd seen the courthouse incident video on social media, along with thousands of others who'd shared and commented on the injustice. "Mom," Maya said, sitting on the edge of the desk, "why are you suing that cop yourself? Why not just hire a lawyer and move on? Let someone else deal with it." Sarah looked up from her files, seeing in her daughter's face the same questions that would soon be answered in the most dramatic way possible. "Because sometimes, baby girl, justice requires more than just winning a case," Sarah explained. "Sometimes it requires changing the entire system. Sometimes it requires showing people that assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, about who has power and who doesn't. Sometimes those assumptions need to be shattered in a way that can't be ignored." Maya studied her mother's face, seeing determination there, but also something else. A kind of strategic patience that came from years of experience navigating systems designed to protect their own. "But it's dangerous, right?" Maya asked. "Going up against the police when you're—" She gestured at her own brown skin, leaving the rest unspoken. "When I'm black," Sarah finished for her. "When I'm a black woman challenging a white officer in federal court. When every assumption, every stereotype, every bit of institutional bias is working against me." She smiled, but there was steel behind it. "Maya, tomorrow you're going to learn something important about power," Sarah said. "Real power doesn't come from the uniform or the badge. It comes from competence, integrity, and the courage to use both when it matters most." Sarah's phone rang, the caller ID showing Chief Johnson, retired. Her mentor from her early days in law enforcement, the man who'd guided her rise through the ranks when others doubted a black woman could lead. "Tomorrow's the day, Sarah." Chief Johnson's gravelly voice carried both pride and concern. "You sure you're ready for this? It's going to be intense." "I've been ready for 20 years, Chief," Sarah replied. Cain represents everything wrong with police culture. The assumption that the badge equals immunity, that certain people don't deserve respect or dignity, that misconduct can be hidden behind the blue wall of silence. "And when you reveal who you are?" Chief Johnson asked. Sarah's voice hardened with determination. "Then Cain learns that the woman he thought he could humiliate with impunity is about to become his commanding officer. Then he learns that actions have consequences, even for people who've spent decades believing they're untouchable." Chief Johnson chuckled, a sound both amused and satisfied. "I almost feel sorry for him," he said. "Almost." After the call ended, Sarah returned to her preparation ritual. She practiced her testimony, anticipating Peterson's cross-examination questions and preparing precise responses. She organized evidence files with the precision of someone who'd built cases that ended careers. She reviewed police procedure manuals, departmental policies, and civil rights case law. Her uniform hung ready in the closet, dress blues with 3 stars that would tomorrow transform her from plaintiff to police chief in a single devastating moment. Maya watched her mother's methodical preparation with growing admiration. "Mom, you've been planning this whole thing, haven't you?" Maya asked. "The lawsuit, the timing, the 2:00 p.m. appointment. This is all strategic." Sarah looked up from her notes. "Planning for justice?" "Yes," she said. "But Cain made his own choices, baby. I'm just ensuring those choices have consequences. I'm making sure that for once, someone who abused their authority faces real accountability." She set multiple alarms on her phone. 6:00 a.m. for final case review, 8:00 a.m. for courthouse arrival, 1:30 p.m. for the transition to police headquarters for the ceremony. Every detail had been considered, every timing calculated for maximum impact. "Maya," Sarah said, "tomorrow you'll see something that doesn't happen often enough in our world. You'll see a black woman not just demand respect, but command it from a position of undeniable authority. You'll see what happens when competence meets opportunity, when preparation meets the right moment." Sarah closed the Cain personnel file and placed it in her briefcase next to her speech for the swearing-in ceremony, 2 documents that would end one career and officially begin another phase of hers. "What happens to Officer Cain after tomorrow?" Maya asked quietly. Sarah's expression was thoughtful but resolute. "He faces the consequences of his actions," she said. "Real consequences, from someone who has the power to enforce them. Not just empty promises of accountability, not just settlements paid with taxpayer money while he continues his career. Real accountability." As midnight approached, Sarah reviewed her timeline one final time, checking each element of tomorrow's carefully orchestrated revelation. Court testimony in the morning, building the case methodically, establishing the facts, exposing Cain's lies. Then, at exactly 2 p.m., the moment when Marcus Cain would discover that the woman he'd slapped, humiliated, and dismissed as unworthy was about to become the most powerful person in his professional world. "Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Sarah said quietly to herself, "everything changes." She turned off the lights in her office, but the weight of tomorrow's revelation filled the darkness. Marcus Cain had no idea that his victim was about to become his judge, jury, and commanding officer all at once. He had no idea that every lie he'd told, every abuse he'd committed, every complaint that had been swept under the rug, was about to be dragged into the light by someone with the authority to act on it. Tomorrow, Sarah would show the world what real accountability looked like. The second day of proceedings began with a shift in momentum that Cain couldn't have anticipated. Sarah's legal team, she had quietly retained counsel for evidence presentation while maintaining her pro-SE status for testimony, entered the courtroom carrying boxes of materials that made Cain's confidence begin to crack like ice over warming water. Attorney Williams, a respected civil rights lawyer who'd been working behind the scenes with Sarah, approached the bench with the gravity of someone about to detonate a bomb. His reputation preceded him: 30 years of civil rights litigation, a track record of taking down corrupt officers and exposing institutional rot. "Your Honor," Williams said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "we have obtained significant evidence that directly contradicts the defendant's testimony and reveals a disturbing pattern of misconduct that extends far beyond this single incident." Peterson immediately shot to his feet, objecting with barely controlled panic. "Your Honor, any additional evidence should have been disclosed during discovery. This is highly irregular." Williams replied smoothly, his response clearly anticipated and prepared. "The evidence was obtained through public records requests that were fulfilled yesterday evening," he explained. "We are prepared to authenticate everything through proper channels and provide the defense with copies for their review. The evidence is substantial, credible, and directly relevant to establishing the pattern of behavior at the heart of this case." Judge Martinez considered for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Williams, but I want proper foundation for all exhibits. Nothing enters the record without authentication." Williams moved to the prosecution table, where a laptop was connected to the courtroom's display system. The large screen flickered to life, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from routine proceeding to something far more significant. "Your Honor," Williams began, "we will present unedited security footage from 4 different camera angles at the federal courthouse, obtained directly from the courthouse security office through an official public records request." Cain's face went pale, the blood draining, so quickly that Peterson noticed and grabbed his arm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams continued, his voice carrying the weight of impending revelation, "you are about to see what really happened on March 15th. Not the edited, manipulated version the defense presented, but the complete, unvarnished truth." The first video began playing, the timestamp clearly visible in the corner. 9:14 a.m., 1 minute before Sarah's arrival. Cain was visible at his security station, laughing with a colleague about something on his phone, completely relaxed and on alert. "Note the defendant's demeanor," Williams narrated. "He shows no signs of being on high alert for security threats. He's casual, laughing, engaged in non-work-related conversation. This is not an officer concerned about courthouse security." At 9:15 a.m. exactly, Sarah entered the frame from the main entrance. Her professional appearance and confident stride were undeniable. This was clearly not someone attempting to sneak into the building or bypass security. She approached the checkpoint with her visitor's pass already visible in her hand, held up for Cain to see. The audio was crystal clear, every word audible to the entire courtroom. Cain's voice dripping with contempt. "Wrong building, sweetheart. The food stamps office is down the street." Sarah's calm response, "I have business here." Cain, without even glancing at her pass, "What business? Baby daddy locked up again?" The jury could see Sarah's composure, her attempt to explain her legitimate purpose, her complete lack of aggression. They could see Cain's escalating hostility without any provocation from her whatsoever. Sarah's voice on the video, "I'm here for a court proceeding, officer." Cain, his contempt now unmistakable, "Sure you are. People like you don't belong in real courtrooms." Sarah, still calm, "People like me?" Cain, stepping closer, invading her space, "Don't play dumb. This isn't some ghetto drama show." And then came the moment that destroyed Cain's entire defense, the moment captured from multiple angles that showed, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what happened. With Sarah standing completely still, her hands at her sides, holding her visitor's pass, not advancing, not threatening, not making any aggressive movement whatsoever. Cain's open palm struck her face with a sharp crack that echoed through the courthouse lobby and now echoed through the silent courtroom. The jury watched in stunned silence as Sarah touched her cheek, as her documents scattered to the floor, as she slowly collected them with dignity and tact, and as she quietly read Cain's name tag before walking away, not fleeing, not running, but walking with her head high despite the humiliation and pain. Williams paused the video, letting the image freeze on screen. Sarah's cheek already reddening, Cain standing over her scattered papers with unmistakable contempt on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams said. Quietly. Officer Cain testified under oath that Ms. Washington was aggressive, threatening, and advancing toward him in a manner that required defensive action. The video evidence from multiple angles clearly shows this testimony was completely and deliberately false. Peterson was frantically whispering with Cain, whose face had gone from pale to ashen gray. His hands were shaking as he reviewed notes, looking for any possible way to explain away what the jury had just witnessed. But Williams wasn't finished. The destruction of Cain's credibility was only beginning. "We also obtained Officer Cain's complete body cam footage from that day," Williams continued, "including the portions that were deliberately edited out of the defense's presentation. The screen split showing the defense's edited version side by side with the complete unedited footage. The manipulation was obvious and damning. Critical portions showing Cain's verbal abuse, his provocative comments, and the unprovoked slap had been deliberately removed from the defense's version. The defense presented edited footage that removed the most damaging evidence of Officer Cain's misconduct," Williams stated. "This represents not just perjury in his sworn testimony, but deliberate tampering with evidence in a federal proceeding." Several jurors were now looking at Cain with barely concealed disgust. The man who'd sat on that witness stand, hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, had been exposed as a liar. Medical examiner Dr. Patricia Carter took the stand next, her credentials impressive. 20 years of forensic medicine, expert testimony in over 200 cases, publications in peer-reviewed journals. Her analysis of Sarah's injuries was methodical and damning. "The bruising pattern on Miss Washington's face is entirely consistent with being struck by an open palm with significant force," Dr. Carter testified, using enlarged photographs to illustrate her points. "The distribution of the contusion, the depth of tissue damage, and the pattern of finger marks all indicate a forceful blow, not incidental contact or defensive maneuvering." She pointed to specific details in the photographs. "The force required to create this level of tissue damage indicates significant impact. This was not a gentle touch or a push. This was a strike intended to cause pain and assert dominance." Peterson attempted to challenge her findings during cross-examination, but Dr. Carter was unshakable. "There are no defensive wounds on Miss Washington's hands or arms," she continued. "No signs of struggle, no scratches or bruises consistent with physical altercation. The injury pattern is entirely one-sided, consistent with an unprovoked assault, not mutual combat or defensive action." But Williams had saved some of his most powerful evidence for the witnesses who'd actually seen what happened. Janet Morrison, the court clerk who'd worked at the courthouse for 15 years, took the stand next. Her testimony would prove devastating. "Miss Morrison," Williams began, "did you witness the incident between Officer Cain and Ms. Washington on March 15th? "I saw the whole thing," Morrison replied, her voice firm and clear. "I was coming back from my lunch break and heard Officer Cain making those awful comments. That poor woman never did anything wrong. She was polite, professional, and he attacked her for no reason except how she looked." "In your 15 years working at this courthouse," Williams continued, "have you observed similar incidents involving Officer Cain?" Peterson objected immediately, but the judge allowed the testimony as relevant to establishing a pattern of behavior. Morrison's answer opened floodgates that Cain had spent years keeping closed. "Oh yes," she said, her voice carrying years of suppressed frustration. "Cain's been doing this for years, always picking on black folks, Hispanic folks, anyone he thinks doesn't belong. Professional people, lawyers, even other officers if they're not white. We've complained to his supervisors multiple times, but nothing ever happens. They just tell us to mind our business and let Cain handle security his way." Morrison identified 12 similar incidents over just the past 18 months, occasions where Cain had subjected people of color to additional security checks, invasive questioning, and humiliating treatment that never identified actual threats. "He calls it keeping the riffraff out," Morrison testified. "But we all know what he really means. He means keeping certain kinds of people out, people who don't look like him." Williams presented Cain's radio communications from that day, obtained through the public records request. Cain's voice was clearly audible on the recording, describing Sarah to his colleagues with casual racism. "Another welfare queen trying to game the system," Cain's recorded voice said. "Handled it appropriately." The final piece of technical evidence came from digital forensics expert Robert Kim, who testified that the body cam footage presented by the defense had been deliberately and skillfully edited. "This level of manipulation requires technical knowledge and clear intent to deceive," Kim explained, showing the jury exactly where segments had been removed and timestamps altered. The missing segments were precisely those that would have shown Officer Cain's initial verbal abuse and the physical assault. This wasn't accidental corruption of the file. This was deliberate evidence tampering. Cain was visibly sweating now, his confident demeanor completely shattered. He kept glancing at the courtroom exit as if considering escape. But Williams had saved the most damaging evidence for last, evidence that would show this wasn't just one bad incident, but a pattern spanning years. "Through public records requests," Williams explained, "we obtained Officer Cain's complete personnel file, including 15 misconduct complaints that were buried or dismissed without proper investigation. The pattern revealed in those complaints was undeniable and sickening. Cain had consistently targeted people of color for harassment disguised as security protocols. In every case, his threat assessments proved to be based entirely on racial bias rather than any actual security concerns." Williams displayed internal emails that showed Cain's supervisors were not only aware of the complaints but actively complicit in covering them up. One email from Cain's lieutenant read, "Cain's methods are questionable but effective at keeping certain elements away from the courthouse. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to maintain order. Let's just keep this quiet." Another from his captain, "As long as no one makes a big stink about it, let Cain handle security his way. He's good at identifying problems before they become incidents." The evidence painted a picture not just of one bad officer, but of an entire system designed to protect him while he abused his authority. Peterson attempted damage control during his cross-examinations, trying to poke holes in the evidence, questioning the reliability of witnesses, suggesting alternative interpretations. But the evidence was overwhelming. Cain's credibility was destroyed, his pattern of abuse exposed in excruciating detail, and his institutional support system revealed as complicit in enabling years of misconduct. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table throughout the evidence presentation, her expression calm but her eyes watchful. She checked her watch periodically, 1:30 p.m., then 1:45 p.m., then 1:52 p.m. The evidence phase had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. Cain wasn't just exposed as a liar and an abuser. He was revealed as part of a systemic problem that had been allowed to fester for years, protected by supervisors more concerned with avoiding controversy than ensuring justice. In just a few minutes, the final piece of Sarah's strategy would fall into place. In just a few minutes, Marcus Cain would learn just how catastrophically he had misjudged the woman he thought he could humiliate with impunity. The clock on the courtroom wall showed 1:58 p.m. Sarah's phone buzzed. The message read, "In position, Ready when you are." Sarah stood, smoothing her suit jacket, and addressed the court. "Your Honor, my 2 p.m. appointment has arrived." At exactly 2 p.m., the courtroom doors opened with an authority that made every head turn. The sound echoed through the space, not just the physical sound of doors swinging wide, but the weight of what those doors represented: power, authority, the changing of the guard. Police Commissioner Reynolds entered first, his dress uniform crisp and commanding, every button polished, every crease perfect. He was followed by 2 senior officials carrying a formal document case, the kind used for important legal documents, official, proclamations, certificates that change lives. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly from legal proceedings to something far more significant, something historic. Judge Martinez looked puzzled, her judicial composure momentarily disrupted. "Commissioner Reynolds," she said, "this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of proceedings. What is the meaning of this interruption?" Reynolds stood at attention, his voice carrying the formal weight of official business. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I have an official announcement that directly pertains to these proceedings and by its time-sensitive nature cannot be delayed." Sarah Washington slowly rose from the plaintiff's table, her movement drawing every eye in the courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, Cain noticed something different about her posture. Not the posture of a victim seeking justice, but the bearing of someone who commanded it. Commissioner Reynolds' voice carried through the silent courtroom with formal authority that demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "it is my honor to inform this court and everyone present that effective immediately, Sarah Elizabeth Washington has been sworn in as the new Chief of Police for our metropolitan area, with full authority over all departmental personnel, operations, and disciplinary procedures." The words hit the courtroom like a physical force. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Journalists scrambled for their phones and notebooks. Community members leaned forward in disbelief. The jury members' eyes widened in shock, several mouths falling open. Peterson's face went slack, his legal strategy crumbling in real time. But Cain's reaction was the most dramatic. His face drained of all color as reality crashed down on him like a collapsing building. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The woman he'd slapped, the woman he'd humiliated, the woman he'd dismissed as belonging at the welfare office, that woman was now his boss. Not just his supervisor, his commanding officer, the person with absolute authority over his career, his future, his very livelihood. Sarah reached for her blazer and removed it with deliberate precision, her movements measured and intentional. Underneath was her dress uniform, midnight blue with polished silver buttons that caught the courtroom lights. 3 stars gleamed on each shoulder, the rank insignia unmistakable. 20 years of service ribbons decorated her chest. Commendations for bravery, medals for community service, awards for leadership excellence, distinguished service honors, marksmanship qualifications, and more. This wasn't someone playing dress-up. This was someone who'd earned every ribbon, every star, every ounce of authority she now wielded. The transformation was stunning and absolute. The plaintiff seeking justice had revealed herself as the ultimate authority figure in law enforcement. The woman Cain had assumed belonged at the welfare office was now the highest-ranking police officer in the entire jurisdiction. "Chief Washington," Judge Martinez said, her voice carrying both surprise and respect, "would you please confirm your new position for the record?" Sarah's voice, when she spoke, carried a new weight of authority that filled every corner of the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor. I am Sarah Elizabeth Washington, Chief of Police, sworn in this morning at 10:00 a.m. at police headquarters with full authority over all departmental personnel and operations within this jurisdiction." Her eyes found Cain's across the courtroom. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time, like someone who just realized they'd made a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. "This includes," Sarah continued with quiet, devastating precision, "full supervisory authority over Officer Marcus Cain and the power to make immediate personnel decisions regarding his continued employment, benefits, pension eligibility, and professional standing." Cain's breathing became shallow and rapid, his chest rising and falling as panic set in. The woman he had slapped, humiliated, and dismissed as unworthy of basic human respect was now his commanding officer. Every racist assumption, every degrading comment, every moment of abuse had been directed at the person who would now determine his professional fate. The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. Commissioner Reynolds stepped forward, addressing the court formally. Chief Washington's first official act was to request a comprehensive review of all pending misconduct cases within the department, with particular attention to patterns of discriminatory behavior, abuse of authority, and institutional failures in accountability procedures. Sarah's briefcase, which had seemed impressive before, now revealed its true significance. She opened it to reveal not just legal documents, but official police files, departmental policy manuals, reform implementation plans, and personnel reviews. This wasn't the preparation of a plaintiff hoping for justice. This was the strategic planning of a new chief executive preparing to overhaul an entire system. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of her new position, "I believe this information provides important context for understanding why Officer Cain's behavior represents not just individual misconduct, but a systemic failure of accountability that I have been brought in specifically to address." Peterson, still reeling from the revelation, attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of his case. "Your Honor," he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence, "this is clearly a conflict of interest. The plaintiff cannot also be the defendant's direct supervisor. This compromises the integrity of these proceedings." Sarah's response was swift, legally precise, and, devastating. "Counselor," she said, her tone professional but unyielding, "my appointment as chief occurred after the incident in question and after this lawsuit was filed. There is no legal conflict. My position does not affect the validity of this case or the jury's ability to render a fair verdict. There is only accountability, something Officer Cain has managed to avoid for 20 years. The courtroom was absolutely silent, everyone processing what had just been revealed. Cain finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper, barely audible. You planned this whole thing?" Sarah turned to face him directly, her 3 stars catching the courtroom lights, her bearing that of someone who'd earned every bit of authority she now wielded. "Officer Cain," she said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable power, "I plan to seek justice for an unprovoked assault. I plan to hold you accountable for 20 years of misconduct. The fact that you assaulted your future commanding officer speaks to your judgment and your character, not my planning." The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it seemed to alter the very physics of the room. Cain, who had entered these proceedings as a confident defendant backed by 20 years of institutional protection and the support of his fellow officers, was now a subordinate officer facing his new chief in federal court after being exposed as a liar, an abuser, and a systematic violator of civil rights. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of official authority, "effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending the outcome of these proceedings and a comprehensive internal investigation into the pattern of misconduct revealed by the evidence presented in this court." Cain's lawyer was frantically shuffling papers, clearly completely unprepared for this development, having no contingency plan for a situation this unprecedented. The jury sat, transfixed, watching a real-time demonstration of justice and accountability that none of them had ever witnessed before. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was a changing of systems, a demonstration that even officers who'd spent decades believing they were untouchable could face real consequences when the right person with the right authority decided enough was enough. Sarah checked her watch one final time, 2:05 p.m. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. The woman Marcus Cain had thought he could humiliate with impunity had just revealed herself as the most powerful person in his professional world. His career, his reputation, his pension, his future, all of it was now in the hands of the person he'd treated as less than human. Justice was about to be served by the very person Cain had wronged, and she had both the authority and the determination to make it stick. The courtroom buzzed with energy as people processed what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was history being made in real time, and Marcus Cain was on the wrong side of it. With her new authority revealed and acknowledged by the court, Chief Sarah Washington approached the area near where Marcus Cain sat, though she maintained the proper courtroom distance and decorum. The roles had reversed so completely that the courtroom felt like it existed in a different universe than it had just an hour earlier. "Officer Cain," Sarah began, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command, "let's discuss your pattern of behavior toward people of color at this courthouse and throughout your career." Peterson objected weakly, grasping at procedural straws. "Your Honor, the plaintiff cannot interrogate the defendant. This is highly irregular." Sarah didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor," she replied smoothly, "I am now appearing in my capacity as Chief of Police, conducting official questioning of a subordinate officer regarding documented misconduct that has come to light during these proceedings. This is well within my administrative authority under departmental regulations and my oath of office." Judge Martinez, still processing the unprecedented situation but recognizing the legal validity of Sarah's position, allowed the questioning to continue. "Proceed, Chief Washington, but let's maintain proper courtroom protocol." Sarah opened a thick file that Cain now recognized with growing horror. His complete personnel record, every complaint, every incident, every covered-up allegation now in the hands of someone who had both the authority and the determination to act on them. "Officer Cain," Sarah said, "in your 20-year career, how many misconduct complaints have been filed against you?" Cain's voice was barely audible, a whisper of defeat. I don't recall the exact number." "Let me refresh your memory," Sarah said, her tone professional but relentless. 15 formal complaints, all involving allegations of discriminatory treatment toward minorities. Would you like me to read them aloud to this courtroom to detail each incident where you abused your authority?" Cain's hands trembled as Sarah methodically began reviewing each incident. The pattern was undeniable and damning. Not isolated mistakes or misunderstandings, but a consistent, deliberate pattern of targeting people based on their race. March 2019, Sarah read, "Maria Gonzalez, a federal prosecutor with 12 years of experience, filed a complaint after you demanded to see her real identification, claiming her bar card and federal ID were suspicious. You subjected her to additional screening that lasted 40 minutes, causing her to miss a court appearance." July 2020, Sarah continued, "Dr. James Mitchell, an African-American federal judge with 15 years on the bench, reported that you questioned his right to enter the courthouse through the main entrance, suggesting he use the service entrance instead. When he identified himself as a judge, you accused him of impersonating a federal official." October 2022. Sarah's voice remained steady, but the content grew more disturbing. "Professor Angela Davis, a constitutional law expert from Georgetown University testifying as an expert witness in a federal case, was subjected to a cavity search based on your suspicion that she was smuggling contraband. The search found nothing. Professor Davis was traumatized and humiliated. With each case, Cain sank deeper into his chair. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. These weren't isolated incidents that could be explained away. They formed a crystal-clear pattern of racial profiling that had been systematically ignored by supervisors more concerned with avoiding controversy than ensuring justice. "Officer Cain," Sarah asked, her question cutting through the courtroom silence like a blade, "in 20 years of service, have you ever filed a misconduct report, conducted an invasive search, or subjected to enhanced screening a white person for suspicious behavior at this courthouse?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Cain's silence was answer enough, more damning than any words could have been. Sarah continued her methodical destruction of not just Cain's defense, but his entire career. "Let's examine the financial cost of your behavior, Officer Cain," she said, pulling out financial documents. "The city has paid $2.3 million in settlements for civil rights violations connected directly to your actions. Were you aware of this figure?" Cain's voice was barely a whisper. "No, ma'am." "Of course not," Sarah said, her tone carrying both disappointment and determination. "Because your supervisors deliberately kept this information from public view to protect your career, and more importantly, to protect their own reputations and avoid scrutiny of their failure to act." Sarah presented email chains that revealed the depth of institutional complicity, supervisors actively covering up complaints, deliberately failing to investigate, and even coaching Cain on how to document encounters to avoid accountability. One email from Cain's lieutenant was particularly damning. "Cain's methods keep the undesirables away. Sometimes the end justifies the means. Just make sure the paperwork looks clean." His captain had responded, "Agreed. As long as no one with real power complains, let him handle security his way. He's effective." "Officer Cain," Sarah's voice grew harder, more commanding, "you didn't just abuse individual citizens. You trained junior officers in these discriminatory practices. How many officers did you mentor in what you called your screening techniques?" Cain's lawyer attempted to object, but Cain was beyond help now, beyond any legal maneuvering that could save him. "5 or 6, he admitted, his voice hollow. "And did you teach them to profile based on race?" Sarah asked. "I taught them to identify threats," Cain replied weakly, trying one last time to hide behind justification. "Threats?" Sarah's voice carried lethal precision. "Dr. Mitchell, a federal judge, was a threat. Professor Davis, a Georgetown law professor, was a threat. Maria Gonzalez, who prosecuted federal crimes for 12 years, was a threat." Each name hit Cain like a physical blow. These weren't anonymous victims easily dismissed. They were accomplished professionals, pillars of their communities, people who'd been humiliated by his prejudice while trying to participate in the justice system. Sarah pulled out victim impact statements that painted a devastating picture of Cain's effect on the community over 20 years. "Parents are afraid to bring their children to the courthouse because of you," Sarah read. "Professional attorneys of color changed their court schedules to avoid your shifts. Law students from minority backgrounds questioned whether the justice system truly served everyone equally after encountering you. You didn't just harm individuals, Officer Cain. You damaged the very foundation of public trust in law enforcement." "Officer Cain," Sarah asked, "do you understand that your actions damaged not just individual citizens, but public trust in law enforcement itself? Do you understand that every person you humiliated, every professional you harassed, every citizen you assaulted with your assumptions and your contempt, every single one of them walked away, believing the justice system was not meant for them?" Cain was crying now, tears running down his face, the weight of 20 years of exposed behavior crushing whatever remained of his dignity. I was trying to do my job," he whispered. Sarah's response was quiet, but carried a fury born of experiencing exactly the kind of abuse she was describing. "Your job," she said, each word deliberate, "was to protect and serve all citizens equally. Your job was to ensure safe access to the courthouse for everyone, regardless of their race, appearance, or your personal prejudices. Instead, you turned this courthouse into a place where people of color were presumed guilty until proven worthy of your approval. You made the entrance to justice a gauntlet of humiliation." Sarah presented financial records showing that Cain's behavior had cost the department millions in settlements, training programs, investigative overhead, and administrative costs. His discriminatory behavior had literally become a budget line item, a recurring expense that taxpayers were forced to cover. "Officer Cain," Sarah said, her voice carrying final authority, "effective immediately, you are terminated from the police department for conduct unbecoming an officer, persistent pattern of civil rights violations, perjury in official proceedings, evidence tampering, and bringing dishonor to the badge and everyone who wears it with integrity." The words hit Cain like a final judgment from which there was no appeal. 20 years of career gone, pension benefits revoked, law enforcement certification permanently stripped, his identity, his livelihood, his future, all gone in a single sentence from the woman he thought he could humiliate without consequence. "Badge and weapon, Officer Cain," Sarah said. "Your law enforcement career is over." Cain's transformation from confident abuser to broken ex-cop was complete and absolute. The system that had protected him for 2 decades, that had enabled his misconduct, covered up his abuses, and allowed him to destroy lives without consequences. That system had finally found someone with both the authority and the courage to hold him accountable. The courtroom remained silent as federal marshals approached to escort Cain from the building. His career in law enforcement was over, and his future would be decided by the criminal charges that would inevitably follow. Sarah returned to the plaintiff's table, her expression calm but satisfied. Justice, real justice, was finally being served. The packed courtroom buzzed with electric anticipation as Chief Sarah Washington prepared to deliver her closing argument. Word of the dramatic identity reveal had spread rapidly, and media crews had arrived, their cameras set up in the designated press area. Community members filled every available seat, standing room only at the back, everyone wanting to witness this historic moment. This had become more than a civil rights case. It was a referendum on police accountability, on justice itself, and on whether the system could truly change when confronted with its own failures. Sarah stood before the jury, her 3 stars reflecting the courtroom lights, but her demeanor remained grounded and accessible despite her revealed authority. She wasn't using her position as a weapon. She was using it as proof that assumptions about who deserves respect and who doesn't are often catastrophically wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah began, her voice clear and measured. 3 hours ago I stood before you as a plaintiff seeking justice for an unprovoked assault. I stand before you now as Chief of Police. But my message remains exactly the same. No one is above accountability, regardless of their badge, their position, or how long they've been allowed to operate without consequences. Her voice carried both personal conviction and professional authority, a unique combination that commanded attention without demanding it. "You have seen overwhelming evidence that Officer Cain committed assault and violated my civil rights," Sarah continued. "But this case represents something far larger than one incident between 2 people. This case is about whether we accept a justice system where assumptions about race determine treatment, where badges protect abuse, and where complaints are buried rather than investigated." Sarah gestured toward Cain, who sat slumped in defeat at the defendant's table, his earlier arrogance completely shattered. "Officer Cain believed he could act with impunity because the system had always protected him," Sarah explained. 15 complaints ignored. $2.3 million in taxpayer money spent covering up his misconduct rather than addressing it. Junior officers trained in his discriminatory methods. Supervisors who chose institutional protection over public accountability. The jury listened intently as Sarah painted the broader picture, connecting Cain's individual actions to systemic failures. This case is about whether we accept a justice system where some people are presumed worthy of respect, while others must constantly prove they belong, Sarah said. Officer Cain didn't assault me because I was threatening. He assaulted me because he assumed I didn't belong, because he looked at me and decided in an instant that I was somehow less deserving of dignity than anyone else who walked through those courthouse doors. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more passionate. When Officer Cain told me the food stamps office was down the street, he revealed his worldview, a worldview where my appearance told him everything he needed to know about who I was and what I deserved. When he asked about my baby daddy, he exposed his prejudices, his assumptions, his complete lack of respect for my humanity. When he struck me for showing legitimate identification, he demonstrated that to him, I wasn't deserving of basic human dignity or the protection of the law. She moved closer to the jury box, her presence commanding, but not intimidating. The defense wants you to believe this was a misunderstanding, a security protocol gone wrong, an officer just doing his job, Sarah said. But his job was never to humiliate citizens based on their appearance. His job was to protect and serve everyone equally, without prejudice, without assumptions, without hatred. Sarah opened her briefcase one final time, pulling out the original visitor's pass that Cain had struck from her hand, now entered as evidence but symbolic of so much more. This piece of paper represents more than just my right to enter a courthouse, Sarah explained. It represents every citizen's right to access justice without being presumed unworthy because of their race. It represents the promise that the justice system belongs to all of us, not just those who look a certain way or come from certain backgrounds. Peterson rose for his closing argument, but his position had become utterly hopeless. The evidence against Cain was overwhelming, his credibility destroyed, and now the plaintiff had revealed herself as someone with undeniable authority and credibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Peterson began weakly, "Officer Cain made a mistake, but destroying a 20-year career over one incident serves no one's interests. He has a family to support. He has dedicated his life to public service." The words felt hollow in the face of the evidence presented. 15 complaints, multiple victims, a pattern spanning years, perjury, evidence tampering, and institutional complicity. Peterson tried to portray Cain as a dedicated public servant overwhelmed by stress, a good officer who'd made one bad judgment call. But the pattern of misconduct, the edited video evidence, the testimony of victims, and the financial cost of his behavior made such arguments laughable. "My client asks for your understanding and forgiveness," Peterson concluded. "He has served this community for 20 years. He has protected people. He deserves compassion and a second chance." Sarah's rebuttal was swift, decisive, and emotionally powerful. "Counselor speaks of Officer Cain's family," Sarah said, her voice carrying both compassion and steel. "But what about the families he terrorized? What about Dr. Mitchell's children who watched their father, a federal judge, be humiliated and questioned at a courthouse entrance for the crime of being black? What about Professor Davis's students who learned that expertise and credentials don't protect you from prejudice when you're a woman of color? What about Maria Gonzalez's family, who watched a dedicated prosecutor break down in tears after being subjected to invasive searches based on nothing but Officer Cain's assumptions?" The emotional weight of Sarah's words filled the courtroom, several jurors visibly moved by the human cost of Cain's behavior. "Forgiveness is important," Sarah continued, "but it cannot come without accountability. Compassion is valuable, but it cannot be selective. Officer Cain had 20 years to change his behavior. 20 years of complaints that should have prompted reflection and reform. 20 years of opportunities to recognize his prejudices and do better. Instead, he doubled down on discrimination. He refined his methods. He trained others in his techniques. He turned harassment into standard operating procedure. Sarah's closing was reaching its crescendo, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience and professional authority. "I became a police officer 20 years ago because I believed in justice," she said. "I pursued law enforcement leadership because I wanted to ensure that the badge represents protection for all citizens, not intimidation for some. I wanted to prove that law enforcement could serve everyone with equal dignity and respect." Her voice carried both personal pain and professional resolve. "Today, you have the power to send a message that abuse of authority will not be tolerated," Sarah said. "That civil rights violations have real consequences. That justice applies to everyone equally, those who wear the badge and those they serve. That the system can change when good people demand it and when those in power have the courage to enforce accountability." She paused, letting her final words carry maximum impact. "Officer Cain assumed I didn't belong in a courthouse. Today, you have the power to show him, and everyone watching, that the only people who don't belong in our justice system are those who abuse their authority and violate the rights of the citizens they swore to protect." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Sarah returned to her seat. Her closing argument had been both a personal reckoning and a call for systemic change, delivered with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to demand both. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, a surprisingly short time given the complexity of the case, but a reflection of how clear-cut the evidence had been. When they returned, the foreman stood with the gravity of someone announcing a historic verdict. The courtroom held its collective breath. "In the matter of Washington versus Cain," the foreman announced, his voice steady and clear, "we find the defendant liable for assault and civil rights violations under federal law. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $500,000 and recommend immediate referral for criminal prosecution." The courtroom erupted. Community members cheered, some openly weeping with relief that justice had finally been served. Media crews scrambled for reactions, cameras flashing. Civil rights advocates embraced each other, celebrating a victory that felt larger than just this one case. Cain's remaining supporters, and there were few left after the evidence presented, sat in stunned silence, unable to process that one of their own had finally faced real consequences. But Sarah's response surprised everyone, demonstrating that her pursuit of justice went beyond personal vindication. She stood and addressed the court directly, her voice cutting through the celebration. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "I respectfully decline the monetary damages awarded to me personally. I request that the full amount of $500,000 be directed to establishing a comprehensive police bias training program and a civilian oversight committee with real investigative power and authority to hold officers accountable." The courtroom fell silent again, people processing what Sarah had just done. She'd won, decisively, but she was giving up the financial compensation to fund systemic change. Judge Martinez nodded with visible approval, respect evident in her expression. "So ordered," the judge said. "The court also recommends that the United States Attorney's Office pursue criminal charges against Officer Cain for assault under color of authority, civil rights violations, perjury in federal proceedings, and evidence tampering. The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending criminal proceedings." Federal marshals moved forward to take Cain into custody. The man who had entered the courthouse that morning as an officer with arresting power was leaving in handcuffs, his career destroyed, his reputation shattered, facing years in federal prison. As the marshals led him away, Cain looked back at Sarah one final time. His expression was no longer contemptuous or angry. It was broken, defeated, the look of a man who finally understood the full weight of his actions and the catastrophic consequences of his prejudices. Sarah addressed the media outside the courthouse steps, flanked by Commissioner Reynolds, community leaders, and civil rights advocates. The crowd that had gathered was substantial. Hundreds of people who'd heard about the verdict and wanted to witness this moment of accountability. Today's verdict sends a clear message that law enforcement officers are not above the law they swore to uphold, Sarah announced, her voice carrying over the crowd. As chief of police, I commit to implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure this pattern of abuse never repeats in our department or our community. A reporter shouted a question over the crowd noise. Chief Washington, do you see this verdict as personal vindication? Sarah's response encapsulated the day's larger meaning, elevating it beyond personal victory to institutional. No, change. This isn't about personal vindication, she said firmly. This is about institutional accountability. Officer Cain's behavior was a symptom of a system that tolerated discrimination, covered up complaints, and protected abusers rather than the abused. Today, that system begins to change. Today, we prove that the badge doesn't grant immunity, it grants responsibility. And with responsibility comes accountability. Another reporter pressed forward. Chief Washington, what message does this send to other officers who might be engaging in similar behavior? Sarah looked directly into the cameras, knowing her words would be broadcast across the nation. The message is simple and clear. If you abuse your authority, if you violate civil rights, if you treat citizens differently based on their race or appearance, you will be held accountable, she said. The days of the blue wall of silence protecting misconduct are over in this department. We will not tolerate abuse. We will not cover up complaints. We will not allow a few bad officers to destroy public trust in the many good officers who serve with honor and integrity. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in this story and share your thoughts in the comments. Was it the moment Sarah revealed who she really was, or the pattern of abuse that had been hidden for so long? Let me know below. The crowd's applause echoed through the courthouse plaza as Sarah Washington, no longer just a victim seeking justice, but a leader with the power to enforce it, outlined her vision for comprehensive police reform. She announced the establishment of mandatory bias training for all officers, civilian oversight with real investigative authority, body cameras with third-party storage to prevent evidence tampering, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior with swift consequences for violations. Change doesn't happen because we hope for it, Sarah said, her voice carrying the passion of someone who'd fought for this moment. Change happens because we demand it, fight for it, and refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Today, we proved that change is possible. Today, we proved that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. The crowd erupted in cheers again, but Sarah wasn't finished. To every person of color who's been made to feel like they don't belong, she continued, her voice strong and clear. To everyone who's been subjected to assumptions and prejudices based on how they look rather than who they are. I see you. I've been you. And I promise you that as long as I have the authority to enforce accountability, no one in this department will treat you as less than the full citizens you are. Maya Washington stood in the crowd, watching her mother with tears of pride streaming down her face. She was witnessing not just her mother's personal victory, but a demonstration that competence, preparation, and courage could overcome even the most entrenched systems of bias and protection. Sarah's story was already spreading across social media, shared millions of times with hashtags like Froj, Justice Served, OS, Chief Washington, Froj, Accountability. The original courthouse video, now viewed with full context, served as a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving. that assumptions about who has power and who doesn't can be catastrophically wrong. 6 months after the courthouse steps echoed with applause for justice served, the transformation was remarkable and comprehensive. The changes Sarah Washington had promised weren't empty rhetoric. They were real, measurable improvements that affected every level of the department and the community it served. Marcus Cain was serving an 18-month federal sentence at a minimum security facility for assault under color of authority and civil rights violations. The judge had been relatively lenient given his cooperation after conviction and his expression of remorse, though many in the community felt the sentence was too light given 20 years of abuse. His law enforcement certification had been permanently revoked across all 50 states. He would never wear a badge again. His pension had been forfeited entirely, the department exercising its right to revoke benefits for officers convicted of felonies related to their duties. The man who once terrorized courthouse visitors now worked in the prison laundry, folding sheets and washing uniforms. His authority had been reduced to nothing, his swagger replaced by the shuffling walk of someone broken by their own actions. Cain's personal life had disintegrated as completely as his professional one. His wife, Linda, had filed for divorce 3 weeks after his conviction. She couldn't face the community shame of being married to a convicted civil rights violator, couldn't reconcile the man she'd thought she married with the monster revealed in court testimony. His children, Michael, 17, and Emma, 15, had changed their last names through a legal petition and moved across the country to live with Linda's sister in Oregon. They were trying to escape the notoriety of their father's disgrace, trying to build new identities separate from his crimes. In rare phone calls from prison, Cain would ask about them, but they refused to speak to him. The man who'd raised them, who'd coached Michael's Little League team and attended Emma's dance recitals, had been revealed as someone they couldn't recognize or forgive. But the more important and positive changes were happening throughout the police department that Chief Sarah Washington now led with vision and determination. Courthouse security incidents involving people of color had dropped by 78% under new protocols that emphasized dignity, respect, and actual threat assessment, rather than racial profiling. Officers were retrained on constitutional policing, implicit bias recognition, and de-escalation techniques that prioritize communication over confrontation. The bias training program funded by the lawsuit settlement had become a national model, copied by police departments in 12 states. It wasn't just lectures and videos. It involved community immersion experiences where officers spent time in neighborhoods they patrolled, participated in cultural competency workshops, and engaged in facilitated dialogues with people who'd experienced police discrimination. Sarah stood before the latest Police Academy graduating class, looking out at the most diverse group of recruits in the department's 150-year history. 40% were women, 60% were people of color, and all had been selected based on rigorous psychological testing, character assessments, and demonstrated commitment to constitutional policing rather than just physical fitness and background checks. Officers, Sarah addressed the graduates, her voice carrying the authority of experience and the passion of purpose. You wear a badge that represents the highest ideals of public service. It does not grant you authority over people. It grants you authority to serve people. There is a profound difference, and your career will be defined by which understanding guides your actions. She walked along the rows of new officers, making eye contact with several. You will face situations where it would be easy to make assumptions, easy to let prejudices guide your decisions, easy to take shortcuts that violate rights, Sarah continued. In those moments, remember why you're here. Remember that every person you encounter is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's loved one. Treat them as you would want your own family treated. The transformation extended far beyond individual officers to systemic changes in accountability structures. Sarah had implemented civilian oversight committees with real investigative power. Not advisory boards that could be ignored, but committees with subpoena authority, independent investigators, and the power to recommend termination. Mandatory body cameras with third-party storage meant footage couldn't be edited or deleted by officers trying to cover up misconduct. The cameras activated automatically during any citizen interaction, and the footage was stored on secure servers managed by an independent company with no connection to the police department. A zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior had teeth. 3 supervisors who had enabled Cain's misconduct were terminated within Sarah's first month as chief. She'd sent a clear message that institutional cover-ups would no longer be tolerated, that protecting bad officers damaged everyone who wore the badge with integrity. The $500,000 settlement had also funded community healing initiatives that brought together people who'd experienced police misconduct with officers committed to reform. These weren't performative conversations. They were difficult, honest dialogues facilitated by professional mediators who helped both sides understand each other's experiences and fears. Former victims of police discrimination now participated in training sessions at the academy, sharing their stories with recruits. The impact was profound. Hearing directly from people who'd been profiled, harassed, or abused made the consequences of prejudice real in ways that lectures never could. Maria Gonzalez, the federal prosecutor who'd been subjected to invasive screening by Cain, now taught a session on constitutional rights and the importance of treating all citizens with dignity. Dr. James Mitchell, the federal judge Cain had questioned and humiliated, participated in a panel discussion on implicit bias and its impact on the justice system. Professor Angela Davis, who'd been subjected to a traumatic and unnecessary cavity search, worked with Sarah to develop new search protocols that balanced security concerns with respect for human dignity and high constitutional protections. The department's relationship with the community had transformed dramatically. Complaint rates against officers had dropped by 62%, not because complaints were being suppressed, but because officers were actually treating people better. Use of force incidents had declined by 54%, as officers trained in de-escalation techniques found they could resolve situations without violence. Community trust in law enforcement, measured through independent surveys, had increased from 34% to 71% among people of color. A remarkable shift in just 6 months that demonstrated how quickly trust could be rebuilt when leadership was committed to real change. Sarah had also established a Truth and Reconciliation program modeled after post-apartheid South Africa, where officers who'd engaged in misconduct could come forward, admit their actions, and commit to reform without facing termination if they genuinely changed their behavior. 7 officers had participated, admitting to racial profiling and excessive force, undergoing intensive retraining, and becoming advocates for reform within the department. The program was controversial. Some community members felt it was too lenient, that officers who'd violated rights should face harsher consequences. But Sarah argued that creating pathways for officers to acknowledge mistakes and genuinely reform was more effective than simply punishing everyone and driving bad behavior underground. Speaking at a national police reform conference in Washington, D.C., Sarah reflected on the journey from victim to victor to visionary, sharing lessons that could help departments across the country. Change doesn't happen because we hope for it, Sarah told the audience of police chiefs, community leaders, and civil rights advocates from across the nation. Change happens because we demand it, fight for it, and refuse to accept that this is just how things are. We have to be willing to confront uncomfortable truths about our institutions, to hold ourselves accountable before we can ask others to trust us. The audience of over 800 people gave her a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes, phones raised to record her words, people visibly moved by her message. Justice isn't just about punishment, Sarah concluded, her voice carrying passion born of personal experience. Justice is about prevention. It's about ensuring that what happened to me, what happened to countless others, never happens again. It's about building systems where accountability is automatic, not exceptional. Where treating all citizens with dignity is the standard, not the aspiration. Maya Washington, now a freshman at Howard University studying criminal justice and public policy, watched her mother's speech via live stream from her dorm room. She was writing a paper on police reform, using her mother's transformation of the department as a case study in effective leadership and systemic change. My mom didn't just win her case, Maya wrote in her paper's conclusion. She used her victory to transform an entire system. She proved that one person with courage, competence, and authority can create change that ripples through communities and inspires reform nationwide. She showed me that justice isn't just about individual victories. It's about using those victories to ensure others don't have to fight the same battles. Sarah's story had inspired reform efforts in 43 states. Police departments from Los Angeles to New York City were studying her initiatives, implementing similar oversight structures, and adopting training programs modeled after her approach. She'd been invited to testify before Congress on police reform legislation, sharing her experience and advocating for federal standards that would prevent the kind of abuse Cain had perpetrated for 20 years. Her testimony was powerful, combining personal narrative with policy expertise, moving several representatives to tears while convincing others that real reform was both necessary and achievable. We cannot continue to allow bad officers to destroy public trust in the good officers who serve honorably every day, Sarah had testified. We cannot continue to prioritize institutional protection over constitutional rights. We cannot continue to tell communities of color that their experiences with discrimination aren't real or aren't important. The cost is too high, measured not just in dollars, but in lives damaged, trust destroyed, and justice denied. The courthouse where Sarah had been assaulted had undergone its own transformation. New security protocols emphasized professionalism and respect. Officers received monthly training on implicit bias and appropriate interaction with all courthouse visitors. A complaint system with independent review ensured that any allegations of misconduct were thoroughly investigated. A plaque had been installed near the entrance, commemorating Sarah's case and the reforms it inspired. The inscription read, "Justice requires both courage to demand it and power to enforce it. May all who enter here be treated with the dignity and respect that the law guarantees to every citizen." 6 months after Marcus Cain's conviction, Sarah stood in her office at police headquarters, looking at the photos on her wall, the same photos that had hung in her home office, documenting 20 years of service leading to this moment. Commissioner Reynolds had called to congratulate her on the dramatic reduction in complaints and the positive feedback from community leaders across the city. "You've done what many said was impossible, Sarah," Reynolds told her. "You've proven that real reform is possible when leadership is committed to it. The department is transforming, the community is responding, and other cities are taking notice." Sarah smiled, but she knew the work was far from finished. "We've made progress, Commissioner," she replied, "but sustainable. Change requires constant vigilance. We can't let success make us complacent. Every day we have to recommit to these principles, to holding ourselves accountable, to earning the trust we're asking the community to give us." She looked at a photo on her desk, the day she'd been sworn in as chief, taken just hours before she walked into that courtroom and changed Marcus Cain's life forever. 6 months ago, I was assaulted by an officer who assumed I didn't belong, Sarah reflected. Today, I lead a department committed to ensuring everyone belongs, everyone is protected, everyone is served with dignity and respect, regardless of race, background, or appearance. That's the transformation we need to protect and expand, she continued. Not just in our department, but in departments across the country. Because every community deserves law enforcement that serves them rather than surveils them, protects them rather than profiles them, and treats them as citizens with rights rather than suspects to be controlled. Maya called that evening, excited to share that her paper on police reform had received the highest grade in her class and was being submitted for a national criminal justice writing competition. "Mom, my professor said your case should be taught in every police academy in America," Maya said, her voice full of pride. "She said you've proven that one person can change systems when they have courage, competence, and commitment." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound satisfaction of knowing that her experience, as painful as it had been, was now creating pathways for others to demand and achieve justice. "Baby girl," Sarah said, "remember that change always starts with someone willing to stand up and say, 'This is wrong, and I won't accept it anymore.' Sometimes that person has authority and power. Sometimes they have to fight for both. But what matters is the willingness to act, to demand better, to refuse to let injustice continue unchallenged." "I learned that from you, Mom," Maya replied. "From watching you turn your pain into purpose, your experience into education, your victory into systemic change. That's what real justice looks like." As the one-year anniversary of the incident approached, Sarah prepared for a community event celebrating the progress made and acknowledging the work still ahead. The event would bring together community members, officers, civic leaders, and people whose lives had been affected by police reform. The venue was the Courthouse Plaza, the same place where Sarah had announced her victory, where community members had celebrated accountability, where the seeds of transformation had been planted. Now, 12 months later, those seeds had grown into substantial change that was reshaping how law enforcement operated and how communities experienced public safety. The event began with testimonials from people whose lives had been affected by the reforms. Maria Gonzalez spoke about no longer experiencing anxiety when entering courthouses, about feeling respected and valued by security personnel who treated her as a colleague rather than a suspect. Dr. Mitchell described bringing his children to the courthouse recently and watching them interact with officers who were professional, respectful, and kind, a stark contrast to the humiliation he'd experienced under Cain's watch. Professor Davis, who had been traumatized by the invasive search Cain had ordered, spoke about her work with Sarah on new protocols and her cautious but growing trust that the department was genuinely committed to change. "I was skeptical," Professor Davis admitted to the crowd. "After what I experienced, I didn't believe the system could change. But Chief Washington has proven me wrong. Real change is possible when leadership prioritizes accountability over institutional protection, when bad officers face real consequences, and when communities are given genuine voice in oversight." Several officers who'd gone through the enhanced training spoke about how it had changed their approach to policing. Officer Jennifer Martinez, a 10-year veteran, described how the implicit bias training had made her confront her own assumptions and prejudices. "I didn't think I was biased," Martinez admitted honestly. "I thought I treated everyone the same. But the training made me realize I was making unconscious judgments based on appearance, neighborhood, how people talked. Now I actively work to check those assumptions, to treat every interaction as fresh, to see the person rather than my preconceptions. It's made me a better officer and a better person." When Sarah took the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. She waited for it to settle, her expression humble despite the hero's welcome she was receiving. "A year ago," Sarah began, "I was assaulted in this courthouse by an officer who assumed I didn't belong. Today, we gather to celebrate not my personal victory, but our collective commitment to ensuring that no one else has to experience what I experienced, what so many in our community have experienced for far too long." She looked out at the diverse crowd, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, young, old, officers in uniform standing beside community activists who'd once protested their actions. "Real change is hard," Sarah continued. "It requires confronting uncomfortable truths, acknowledging past failures, and committing to do better even when it's difficult. Over this past year, our department has done that work. We've held ourselves accountable. We've terminated officers who refuse to change. We've implemented systems to catch problems before they become patterns. We've opened our doors to community oversight and civilian input. She paused, letting her words sink in. But we're not done. Reform isn't a destination. It's a continuous journey. Every day we have to recommit to these principles. Every day we have to earn the trust we're asking you to give us. Every day we have to prove through our actions that the badge means protection and service for everyone, not just some. Sarah shared statistics that demonstrated the transformation. Complaint rates down 68% from the previous year, use of force incidents reduced by 61%, community trust surveys showing 74% of residents now had confidence in the department, crime clearance rates up 22% as community cooperation increased, and officer morale improved as they no longer had to cover for or work alongside officers who violated the values they believed in. These numbers tell a story, Sarah explained. They tell us that when officers treat people with dignity, communities respond with cooperation. When accountability is real, trust grows. When bad officers are removed, good officers thrive. When we prioritize constitutional policing over convenience, everyone is safer and justice is more than just a word. It's a reality people can experience. She introduced the newest initiative, a community police partnership program where residents and officers work together on neighborhood safety planning, crime prevention strategies, and youth mentorship programs. We're not just reforming how we police, Sarah said. We're reimagining what public safety means. It's not just about responding to crime. It's about preventing it through strong community relationships, economic opportunity, youth programs, and addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. The event concluded with the announcement of the Marcus Cain Memorial Scholarship, a name chosen deliberately to transform his legacy from one of abuse to one of reform. The scholarship would fund college education for young people from communities disproportionately affected by police misconduct who wanted to pursue careers in criminal justice, law, or public policy. We can't erase what Marcus Cain did, Sarah explained, but we can ensure that his actions lead to something positive. This scholarship will help the next generation of leaders who will continue this work of reform, who will build on what we've started, who will create the truly just system we're all working toward. Maya Washington was the scholarship's first recipient, having written her application essay about watching her mother transform personal pain into systemic change and her own commitment to continuing that work. As the sun set over the courthouse plaza, Sarah reflected on the journey from that morning 12 months ago when she'd been slapped and humiliated to this moment of celebration and continued commitment to justice. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chief Johnson, her mentor. "Proud of you, Sarah. You didn't just win your case, you changed the game. That's real leadership." Sarah smiled, looking out at the crowd of people who'd come together, people who'd once been divided by fear and mistrust, now united by shared commitment to real justice and genuine accountability. This is where we need your voice. If this story moved you, if Sarah's journey from victim to victor to visionary inspired you, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to True Justice if you haven't already, and drop a comment sharing your biggest takeaway from this story. Was it the moment of revelation? The pattern of abuse finally being exposed? The transformation of an entire system? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and your perspective matters. And here's the thing. Stories like this need to be shared. Someone in your life needs to hear about Sarah Washington's courage, about how one person's refusal to accept injustice sparked systemic change. Share this video with them. Post it on your social media. Let people know that accountability is possible, that change is achievable, that justice, real justice, can prevail when people have the courage to demand it and the determination to enforce it. Before you go, let me ask you this. If you were in Sarah's position, facing humiliation and assault from someone who thought you were powerless, would you have had the patience to plan your response so strategically? Would you have had the strength to turn personal pain into institutional change? Think about that and share your honest thoughts below. Next week, we're bringing you another story that proves justice can triumph over prejudice and assumptions. Judge dismisses black student's case until she reveals she's Harvard Law Review editor. You won't want to miss how this brilliant young woman dismantles the assumptions that tried to silence her voice. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss it. Remember, justice may be slow, but it's worth fighting for. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and never let anyone convince you that you don't belong where you have every right to be. Every person who's been underestimated, dismissed, or judged by appearance deserves to be seen for who they truly are. That's what Sarah Washington proved, and that's what we're here at True Justice to show you again and again. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of a community that believes in real accountability and genuine justice. I'm grateful for every one of you who takes time to watch these stories, to engage with these important issues, and to demand better from the systems that are supposed to serve us all equally. Until next time, keep demanding justice, keep fighting for what's right, and keep believing that change is possible when courageous people refuse to accept the status quo. This is True Justice, and we'll see you in the next one.